Baal is a bit of an enigma. Really, I've seen dozens of theories about her motivations for collecting visions and lots of speculation on whether or not she's currently possessed or if she's even the real Archon. I've seen people arguing over whether or not she still has her gnosis, and frankly, as much as I'd love to try to answer any of these questions, we just lack information right now to draw any solid conclusions. But that doesn't mean I won't try, and it also does not mean that I'm not going to get sucked into another lengthy tangent. You have been warned. So have a seat, strap in, and grab a snack or something because this is going to be an extremely speculative and probably long video. But a quick reminder and disclaimer, this is a theory video. A lot of research goes into these videos and I try to be as accurate as possible where I can, but I am not perfect and I make mistakes. Please don't take my speculations as facts, and as always, you are responsible for doing your own research. Got all that? Good. On to the video. This is our actual first encounter with Baal, and I think it has some unique insights to her motives and personality that we don't get to see in-game. At least, not as of version 2.0. Note the name of this chapter, Omnipresence over Mortals. Now compare it to the name for the beginning of the 2.0 Archon Quest. These are two very different titles, and both are referencing a different god. It's not as obvious in the English Travail trailer, but did you know that in Chinese it actually says something like mortals under the 1,000-hand, 100-eyed heaven? This is a pretty obvious reference to the statue in the middle of Inazuma City and not Baal herself, which is really odd when you think about it. The next line is a little misleading in English as well. The original Chinese could be translated along the lines of the god who chases eternity. What eternity does she see in mortals? These two translations are very different. English is from the perspective of mortals, and Chinese is from the perspective of Baal. From this line, I'm going to suggest that Baal may not see eternity in mortals themselves, but may seem some form of eternity contained within their visions. Big thanks to Zara on the Comria Discord server for these translation notes. Now, what confuses me the most about Baal actually comes from her contradictory surroundings. From her design, to her element, to her whole country, everything around her just screams of transience, while Baal herself defiantly proclaims her ideal is that of eternity. For example, let's take a look at something really banal, like the flowers she wears. These aren't just flowers she picked at random one morning to plop in her hair, as they're quite literally symbolically representative of her. And you know how I know that? I broke into her house. And looky what I found on her door. Yep, same flowers. No one engraves the door to their personal quarters with something that's completely at odds with what they believe in. That's just silly. Anyway, these flowers are probably morning glories. They're known as asagao in Japan, and they typically mean brief love and longing. The blossoms themselves are pretty short-lived, so they're also associated with the fleeting nature of love. It's not exactly the epitome of eternity in a flower, now is it? Otherwise, they would be known for eternal love, and they're not. But instead, tulips are, which is weird because tulips have blossoms that do not last that long and fall off like really quickly, so I don't know how flower meanings get assigned, but that's a whole nother thing. Anyway, that same hairpin that hosts the flowers also has a butterfly on it, and butterflies can also be found on the trim of her shorts. Butterflies are symbols of transformation or metamorphosis. Still definitely not a symbol of eternity. And of course, there's her element, electro. I don't need to explain much here, do I? Lightning flashes only for an instant and then it's gone. That is not eternal. That's like brief, fleeting. It's transient in nature. Do you see the pattern? And as for the nation of Inazuma, well, it's covered by the sacred sakura tree. Sakura trees are known in Japan for the distinctively short lifespans of their blossoms. The blossoms are also associated with the fragility of life, impermanence, and renewal. So where are these symbols of this so-called eternity? I can't find any. Where Mondstadt lives and breathes Barbados' ideal of freedom and Liyue revolves around Morax's ideal of contracts, Inazuma seems to be a country of contradictions. This may actually explain why Kazuha suspects the Electro Archon no longer believes in the ideal she once used to. The same ideal that allowed Electro visions to be granted is no longer anywhere to be found. I would therefore like to argue that Baal used to believe that transience was eternity. Like life is an eternal cycle of death and rebirth, that kind of thing. I think something changed her mind in recent times, and now she believes that eternity should essentially be one moment that never ends, never changes, and never dies. Zhongli says outright that Baal closed Inazuma because of visions. She wished to seize all visions within Inazuma and inlay them upon the hands of her omnipresent god statue. He says she wants visions precisely because they are divine blessings, and that they should therefore belong solely to divinity. He also goes so far as to suggest that she's been thinking about eliminating potential threats to her eternity for quite some time, meaning this wasn't a rash decision, it was premeditated, probably pretty heavily. His perceived death will be seen by her as a confirmation that her eternal reign can crumble just as easily and quickly as Zhongli's has. Of course, this is all his speculation, but given that he's met with her and spoken with her on even terms, it's safe to assume there's at least some grains of truth in his words.
Knowing her, she must have again quoted that adage she is most fond of when proclaiming that decree to her people. 7 ideals for 7 gods, and of these, eternity is nearest unto heaven.
Zhongli's line reads a bit like Baal is just being conceited in thinking that her ideal is the best and therefore should be the most associated with the divine. But the Electro Gemstone has a very different tone. This body is the noblest and most eminent of all in this world. It should hold absolute control over this world. It once promised its people a dream, the never-changing eternity. Not once does Baal directly reference herself here. She says this and it, not I or my, when referring to this divine body. So what if she's not talking about herself at all, or even her own ideal? What if she's talking about the ideal of the 1,000-armed, 100-eyed statue? The statue that resembles the Welkin moon? This is really more confirmation for me than anything else because I have, in fact, already covered this topic in another video where I was making predictions. Go watch it if you want more context because we still have a lot to cover and not a whole lot of time. So anyway, if you really think about it, Baal might actually be the Archon of eternal transience that wishes to pursue or resurrect the ideal of that which is most divine, the ideal of true eternity. An ideal that does not actually belong to Baal. And Yae actually has a line that supports this idea.
When that ambition disappeared, he began to doubt himself. As he battled his growing anxiety, he slowly descended into the state you see him in now. Much like a certain fatally flawed friend of mine.
If Yae is in fact talking about Baal here, which I suspect she is, we can safely assume that Baal's current mindset is a result of her own anxiety. Meaning Baal's conviction over her ideal has been shaken so profusely in recent times that she's actually lost her way. Now, I am aware that many folks believe that Baal is either not the real Archon or that she's been possessed, and that's what's driven her to such lengths instead. And there are some good reasons for that. Baal sounds empty and robotic when she speaks for the most part, and she's surrounded by foxes who are known for possession, both consensual and otherwise. And don't get me wrong, Yai is a fox and is sus as hell, but I was also really sus of Ningguang back in the day, and that turned out to be a whole lot of nothing, so slap that skeptic sticker on me and call it a day. I just don't think she's pulling strings so much as assisting the Archon and casually observing the results. She apparently doesn't leave the shrine that often, and the shrine happens to be sitting on an Ajdaha-esque ley line tree, so I just wonder if she's channeling ley lines to get her intel. Kinda like how Ajdaha can. And did. That would make her a mythical beast in service of her region's Archon, something like how Zhongli had the Adepti and the Yaksha and Ajdaha, obviously. In fact, I wonder if Baal is utilizing Yai's abilities, like channeling them somehow. And I have no real grounds for this from Genshin itself, but I can make a case for this being a story angle that MiHoYo might take by looking at a couple of details from Honkai. And no, I am not using this as actual justification for my argument, and no, you don't need to know anything about Honkai in order to say what I'm about to present, and no, this will not be a regular occurrence, I just thought this was super suspicious. Anyway, Baal's equivalent in Honkai is a girl named Raiden Mei, while Yae Miko's is a girl named Yae Sakura. Under really specific circumstances, Mei allows Sakura to possess her body. This results in some physical changes within Mei's body, as her hair then turns pink and she gains fox ears, kind of? Sakura also has a mark on the back of her neck, which is a pink tomoe symbol, and this matches the same symbol on the back of Baal's neck in Genshin. In addition, the sword that Baal pulls from her chest looks a lot like a recolored version of a blade known as the Domain of Sanction, which is a weapon featured in Sakura's story quest in Honkai. So I think that's enough evidence to suggest that there's at least a literary possibility that MiHoYo could revisit this idea in Genshin. Not saying that this will be the actual plot and that they'll use everything verbatim, but I just wanted to point out that MiHoYo has used consensual fox-based possession in the past with these two very, very similar characters. That's it. End of argument. Moving on. Anyway, Honkai references aside, I've also wondered if Baal might be trying to use Yae to stabilize her own powers and or emotions. Like, think about it. If Baal has lost sight of her ideal due to her own anxiety, then Yae might be her anti-anxiety medication. Something to stabilize her state of mind so she can properly function. Or maybe Baal's anxiety is so bad that she keeps herself locked within her chambers and sends an empty vessel to make public appearances instead. One that looks exactly like her, that she can pilot from a safe distance, perhaps with the help of Yae's powers of possession that we're assuming she has, because, you know, she's a fox, and that's what foxes do in Japan. Now, as far as making a case for Baal to have a secondary body, you may recall that Zhongli used an exuvia when he faked his own death. That was that dragon thing. Remember that? It fell from the sky? Now, if you don't know what an exuvia is outside of the Genshin context, it's basically like when an insect sheds its outer layer. So it's kind of like a hollow shell or an empty husk. It may still contain Archon power on some level or some sort of residual energy, but it's not necessarily the Archon itself, so therefore there is a precedence for Baal to have her own sort of exuvia. Which brings me to Scaramouche. Stifle your skepticism. I am definitely not the first person to think this, and there's been a lot of speculation about a relationship between him and Baal for a very, very long time. 246 days as of recording this video. And I believe what actually started this conversation was again something that's related to Honkai Impact. We talked about her before, but the character that governs over thunder in Honkai is known as Raiden Mei, and Scaramouche actually has his entire outfit based on one of her outfits. Now that Baal has been released officially, we can also note that her outfit is also based on a version of one of Raiden Mei's outfits. Rest assured that this is the last mention of Honkai Impact in this video. All other similarities between these two characters are actually found within Genshin. I just wanted to point out where this whole thing started. Baal's other name is actually Raiden, in the same way that Zhongli's name is also Morax, and Barbados is also Venti. This is important to note because in Japanese mythology, Raiden, or Raijin, is the god of thunder, and what's more, he's typically accompanied by his brother, Fujin, the god of wind. Both have very distinctive adornments. Raiden has the thunder drums, while Fujin carries a bag of winds on his back. Now, Baal has her thunder drums visible on her Statue of Seven, as well as on her back during combat. And Scaramouche carries a weird little bag on his back that seems to suit no particular purpose, but could definitely be referencing Fujin's bag of winds, which would also mean that Scaramouche has a good chance of being an anime character, and I think that's hilarious. Anyway, moving on. Baal and Scaramouche also have the same coloring, specifically with their hair, which of course is not a rare thing until you turn Scaramouche's model around and take a look at the backside of his head, where you'll find two very pale purple streaks. These are identical to the streaks in Baal's braids. They both also have the same eye pattern, so while the colors differ slightly, the shines and placements of the designs within the eye are in fact nearly identical. This is actually huge because the only other characters to have matching eye patterns like this are Barbara and Jean, and those two are siblings. Everyone else has completely unique patterns for their eyes. And just as a quick note though, all Archons have what appears to be a glowing pupil, and a halo glowing effect of the pupil is missing from Scaramouche, which makes sense because he's not an Archon, but it is worth mentioning because it is a difference. Anyway, let's talk about Scaramouche's incredibly distinctive hat, because that's a comfortable segue. I think it's pretty weird for him to wear this hat, not because it's huge or that its design is particularly odd, but because it's actually rendered after a hat known as an uchikatsugi. An uchikatsugi is a large, wide-brimmed hat with a very long veil that was only really worn by women. As far as we know, Scaramouche is not and does not identify as female, so it's a little odd that he's wearing a woman's hat. Why would he do that? Because I suspect that he may have been intended to be female originally, not by the game designers, but by in-game lore context. I swear this will make sense in a minute, just hang on. Many theorists, myself included, think that Scaramouche is the character being talked about in the Pale Flame set's Surpassing Cup. I believe he's the only one of the Fatui noted as being fair of face on his original introduction, and this descriptor is also used in the Surpassing Cup in both English and Chinese, so it has to be a pretty important feature of the character it's describing. And after the cup calls its owner very fair of face, it goes on to talk about how its owner was divinely created, but then cast away like worthless straws. You know, like a waste product, like sawdust. Right? It's kind of useless. This implies that whoever created him thought he had some kind of flaw that was unacceptable. It then says that he woke up on his own and it was never intended that he do so, which to me means that he wasn't supposed to be anything more than a shell at first, but somehow he came to life on his own. You know, like Frosty the Snowman, but many times more angry and small. Heck, we've seen him do the whole waking up on his own thing once before in the Unreconciled Stars event when he woke himself up from the meteor-induced coma without any assistance, 256 days ago, as of recording this video. No, I'm not salty. Don't ask me. So assuming Scaramouche is the Surpassing Cup, it's likely that he was divinely created as some kind of empty vessel, but cast aside because he wasn't perfect. Then he woke up on his own and started to wander the world like the angry little rodent that he is. Then he met the Fatui and decided to join them because what else is he gonna do? Which brings us to the Fatui constellation wheel. Now we can only really confirm 3 of these, the first obviously being Sandrone, as he's the puppeteer or the puppet. I don't think it matters which one, because that is clearly a puppet or a marionette. And the second being the narwhal, which is obviously Child, because that is his constellation, we've seen it. And the third being the moth, which is La Senora. I will probably go into why she's the moth in another video, but that explanation is long, so for now just accept the fact that her mask is basically a moth and it matches the constellation and move on. Now, for a long time, that little figure to the right of the moth was actually thought to be La Senora. But upon closer inspection, that little figure is probably a doll holding a heart. You know, like a doll that suddenly was brought to life, like Pinocchio. He just grew a heart one day. In fact, that doll actually resembles something called an Ichimatsu doll, a doll that was named after a very popular kabuki actor, well known for his part in playing young male roles. So this constellation could possibly be a doll that came to life through some bizarre miracle, and therefore aligning with the Surpassing Cup story, and through some incredibly random cosmic prank, winds up as the constellation of the tiny but angry Scaramouche. And what does this have to do with Baal, and what does this have to do with me suggesting that Scaramouche was supposed to be a female? Well, circling back to my initial theory that Baal's anxiety may have pushed her to create an exuvia of sorts, it's entirely possible that Scaramouche is a failed iteration of Baal's exuvia, which was then cast aside because it wasn't perfect. Then it somehow gained a will of its own and walked off to join the world's largest crime syndicate. Baal doesn't seem to care about this that much because she probably just made a new one and is using that one instead. Anywho, piloting her own exuvia remotely also allows her to be both the real Archon and not the real Archon at the same time because it's really her, but in a not-so-real body. And what's interesting about this hypothesis is it actually is supported by her name, Baal. Chances are good that you've heard by now how each Archon is actually named after the demons in the Lesser Key of Solomon from the Ars Goetia. Morax, Barbados, and Paimon are, at least, plus a few other random mentions that we're not going to go into right now, but Baal actually is not in the Lesser Key of Solomon. Baal and Belial are in the Lesser Key, though. And yes, I know that some people consider Baal to be an alternate spelling for Baal, and that is technically valid, but it's definitely odd MiHoYo didn't choose to name her Baal, but explicitly chose the spelling Baal. I've already looked into the name Baal across a few different cultures, and I've actually found some weird things. For example, Baal, with the apostrophe, is actually the Hebrew word for Lord, and was therefore used a lot in reference to many gods and even kings. In fact, it was used so frequently that my current list of alternate Baal names and associations includes, but is not limited to, oh my god, Baal Zebub, Baal Zebob, Baal of the Flies, Baal Berith, or the Lord of the Covenant, Baal Haman, Baalah, Baalaz, Baal Peor, Baal Zaphan, Baal Tarz, Bel, Belusis, Belial, and Baal. Trust me, this list is actually a lot longer, and my pronunciation is so terrible that I don't even dare to go through the rest of them. But anyway, aside from that list, Baal as a name was most commonly associated with the Canaanite deity Hadad. I'd have immediately written this off as a coincidence under normal circumstances, but Hadad is the Canaanite deity of storms and thunder. You know, like the Japanese Raiden. Not only is he typically portrayed with lightning bolts, but in Mesopotamian mythology, he really hated snakes. Especially snakes that were associated with the Yamu, the Canaanite sea and river god. In fact, Hadad slew not one, not two, but 3 giant serpents of Yamu, and was also hailed as a vanquisher of the sea as a result. I don't know about you, but that sure sounds a lot like how the Raiden Shogun struck down Orobashi. You know, the giant serpent whose bones are all over the place. That guy. We'll probably learn a lot more about him in the future. But if all that wasn't enough, Hadad was decried at one point as a false god. And if you know anything about Gnosticism, which Genshin is heavily based on, it deals a lot with the idea of defeating the false god, also known as the Demiurge. And I am not suggesting that Raiden is the Demiurge, but I do think that her choice of name in Baal instead of Baal might support the idea that she's at least not as she appears. Meaning, there is a part of her that is false, like say, her body. So that's it then. Baal is simply suffering from severe anxiety to the point where she'll use a fox as a sedative of sorts, remotely control an empty vessel from a distance, and accidentally let one of her failed vessels gain sentience and wander off to join a notorious criminal organization. That's my whole analysis of her character as of version 2.0. It's actually kind of relatable in a weird sort of way. Of course, there's a lot more to the story of Inazuma beyond just Baal's role within it. We know she'll be joining us very soon, as of version 2.1, and we also know that there's quite a bit of Inazuma story left after she joins us. That suggests to me that Baal is just a prelude to something much bigger. It would also mean she's not evil, which is nice. I'm also really looking forward to seeing how the statue ends up playing into all of this in the end, as well as learning more about visions and maybe, if we're lucky, finding out what the hell was up with that blood-red moon in Baal's domain. And again, if you're curious on my thoughts on that moon, you might want to check out my last video on the statue and the Staff of Homa. There's a link in the description. And that, my friends, is all I have for you today. Thanks a bundle for stopping by, and don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you guys think of Inazuma thus far, and what you think might happen in the next couple of patches. Just take care, guys, and I'll see you next time.